Okay, good afternoon. I'm Evelyn Lantz. This is the Houston LaRouche PAC meeting for December 29th, the last one in 2018. And the discussion, the bulk of it is going to be what was inspired by this book called Dreamland, which you need to read the book. Everyone should read this book. It's, if you've ever seen the movie To Kill a Mockingbird, if someone were to have simply said what happened, you wouldn't get the idea. And it's the same thing with Dreamland. I'm going to tell you what he documents, but the story that you need to actually come to grips with is in the book itself. The other book that's important, and I want people to can somebody just come get this? We can pass it around. Everyone should have that book to understand what could have been the future instead of what we got with the opioid epidemic. But I want to begin with a short political update because all you're hearing in the news is shutdown and border wall. But what's actually happening in the world is better described as the Peace of Westphalia beginning to come into existence. And this is not just what President Trump did to order the troops out of Syria and the beginning of the troops out of Afghanistan. And you can tell how good it is by all the squealing and squawking and hollering that's going on. But also the moves that are being made, which are basically to implement this, the LaRouche Doctrine for Southwest Asia. This was put out by the LaRouche presidential campaign back in 2004, which is the last time that Lyndon LaRouche personally ran for president. And it was just a couple of years into the Iraq War. And LaRouche laid out a proposal in which he said that the countries of the region had to be organized around a solution. And he specifically said a solution to the Iraq crisis, but all of Southwest Asia. He specifically said Iran, Turkey, Syria, and Egypt. And if you begin to find out what is going on in Southwest Asia today, those countries are coming together, and almost all of them came under an attack in the period since 2004 to try and overthrow their governments and turn those countries into chaos instead of actually functioning governments. And they've overcome that with the help of Russia, and now increasingly with the help of President Trump's policies. And just to give you a sense, not only are the troops being withdrawn and are there moves toward a constitutional convention in Syria, not only is it a situation in which 99% of the territory of Syria is no longer under the control of ISIS, but you now have a reversal of a policy that was imposed on the Arab League. In 2011, the Arab League expelled Syria from the Arab League as part of trying to undermine the government there of Bashar al-Assad. They are now in the process of readmitting Syria to the Arab League. The United Arab Emirates just opened an embassy in Damascus. It's expected that Bahrain, which is very close to Saudi Arabia, will open an embassy. There have been discussions between high-level officials in Egypt and Syria in the last few days. So you have coming together something, and as Mrs. LaRouche emphasized, the Peace of Westphalia was not simply the people decided they wanted to be nice to each other, because the idea of the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War in Europe, a religious war, in 1648, actually ended 150 years of war, starting in 1492. And it wasn't just the idea that the good of the other, the advantage of the other, was something that people said, oh, that's a nice idea, maybe we should try that. Everyone and everything was exhausted and destroyed by war. And unless a different policy was adopted, it was clear that civilization wasn't going to survive. And at that point, they adopted a different policy. And we're on the edge of something that tremendous now. And the coordination between the US and Russia and China, which there's been such an attempt to prevent, is continuing to inch along despite that. Just want to read one text from Donald Trump from about 4 hours ago. He says, just had a long and very good call with President Xi of China. This deal is moving along very well. If made, it will be comprehensive, covering all subjects, areas, and points of dispute. Big progress being made.
Wow.
So that is the latest on that. So with that, let me proceed with the main topic for today. And I want to start with the other book, which is the book called As He Saw It. Because Roosevelt had a vision, Franklin Roosevelt, for the United States and for the world after World War II, which was very different than what we got with his death and Truman coming in and being under the thumb of the British. And one of my friends in New Jersey recently discovered the last page of that book, which is quite extraordinary. And if you ever wondered why the U.S. is suffering a drug plague and what the consequences are, this is what Elliot Roosevelt had to say. He says, I have come to the question, what can we do? We who are not simply officials in the American government, but something far more important, which is to say, American citizens. What can we do to ensure our government's return to the path that was charted by Franklin Roosevelt? To answer this question, I must set down very briefly a lesson that was taught me first by history and later by observation of my father as president. Those presidents of our country were greatest, I am convinced, who were most sensitive and most responsive to the informed and intelligent will of the people. Lincoln could not sign the Emancipation Act, freeing the slaves, until nearly 2 years after the Civil War had begun. Not because there was not pressure from the North that he should do so, but because there was not sufficient pressure. There is a relationship in American democracy between their president and the people, which only too rarely is what it should be. We who are sovereign, who are American citizens, must help if any president is to be a great president. If Franklin Roosevelt was a great president, it was, in the main, thanks to the articulated intelligence of the American people during his terms in the White House. Now, think what that means for the ability of our nation to function, much less have a great government, if the population is destroyed. If the capability of the population to think and be articulate is destroyed. And that's what we've seen happen, especially in the last 50 years. Now, 50 years ago, and Keisha may have more to say about this later, but 50 years ago today, we were at a cusp between those two policies, the policy of development of the nation and the policy of destruction of the nation. It was 1968. And people can remember what happened in 1968. Dr. King was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was assassinated. There were riots. And basically, the Democratic Party, as the party of FDR and the party of development, was assassinated at the riots that were held at the Chicago Convention. But in December of 1968, man, for the first time, went beyond the orbit of the Earth to another body in the solar system. This was Apollo 8, where human beings went to the moon and orbited the moon. And as people know, there was a very beautiful message from those astronauts on Christmas Eve. And then they came back 2 days ago, December 27th. And one of the things that struck me as interesting in the write-ups about this is that the press was not much better then than it is now. A little bit, but not a whole lot. And yet the effect of optimism on even the press was made clear by the Time magazine. Time magazine chooses a man of the year every year. They've chosen Mussolini. They've chosen, various rotten people. This year they chose
Khomeini.
Ayatollah Khomeini. This year they chose journalists, and Khashoggi in particular, but journalists in general, at the very point that the president of the United States has been saying something truthful, which is journalists are the enemy of the people. But in 1968, anybody want to try and guess who they chose?
Yuri Gagarin.
Cedric?
The crew of the
Apollo.
Crew of the Dr. King's not a bad, the crew of Apollo 8. And, people should, that what I'm going to go through is pretty harrowing, but you should have a sense of overall optimism, excuse me, because there have been two choices, and we continue to fight that fight and are on the edge of winning it. Now, can we put the first map up? There was, in terms of the opioid crisis, there was just a report released by the Centers for Disease Control. And they said that between 1999 and 2017, there were 700,000 Americans who died from drug overdoses. And this is a map that shows you where. And that circle is West Virginia. And just across the river from West Virginia is an area in Ohio, which is one of the things we're going to focus on, including the city of Portsmouth, Ohio. But
what was the years you said again?
1999 to 2017, about 18 years. 2017, the most recent year, was over 70,000 deaths. And that is more than the number of people killed in the Vietnam War during the entire war, just last year. Americans, yeah, sorry. Number of Americans. And 47,600 of these deaths were from opioids, from various synthetic forms of heroin, basically, and heroin itself. So you can see, you know, that it's spread across the country. And one of the things that was striking to me, look at all the rural areas that are heavily infested with the drug problem. This is not the old New York City, Los Angeles, you know, Central City kind of problem. It's a nationwide problem, and it was created to be exactly that. Now, next slide. What? This is called Good and Evil, staring you in the face. Lyndon LaRouche and Sir Bertrand Russell. And they each had an idea of what the world should look like and what they thought of, you know, human beings. And I want to read you a short quote from Lyndon LaRouche, who understood the evil of Bertrand Russell and the British at least as well as they did themselves. He says, all imperial systems in their character depend for their conditional durability on stifling those creative powers of the human individual, which are expressed typically in the form of discovery of universal physical principles or classical artistic activity. The design is intended to degrade the great mass of humanity as virtual cattle to a condition of mental life in which human mental life is brought to resemble the farmer's herd of cattle. And then he goes on to say, the destruction of classical culture in the mid-1960s and the brutish dogmas of practice of that piece of fascist filth of Adorno in the book, The Authoritarian Personality, are typical of such swinishness. The empire, just because it is an empire in terms of embedded cultural characteristics, is probably doomed simply for the reason that it would prefer to die than abandon those features of embedded cultural reflexes which define it as an empire. For the rest of us, says LaRouche, the question is, do we prefer to go down with the empire or to cut free from both its physical and, more importantly, its cultural embrace? So that was what LaRouche had to say. Here's what Bertrand Russell had to say. This is in a 1931 book, The Scientific Outlook. He says, ordinary men and women will be expected to be docile, industrious, punctual, thoughtless, and contented. Of these qualities, probably contentment will be considered the most important. In order to produce it, all the researches of psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and biochemistry will be brought into play. Says, it will be recognized that it is their business, the business of scientific technique, to improve science in order to keep manual workers contented by means of continual new amusements. So you have one person who's warning that it's human creativity. We can turn the lights back on if somebody would, so I can see a little bit better. So who's warning that it's human creativity that is the crucial thing and that it is endangered. And then you have the question of Bertrand Russell and the British Empire, who were explicit on the commitment to destroying it in order to maintain power. Now, this is the introduction, and I want to just read a short story from this so you get the idea. In the middle-class neighborhood on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, where Miles Schoonover grew up, the kids smoked weed and drank. He and his younger brother, Matt, went to a private Christian school in a Columbus suburb. Their father, Paul Schoonover, co-owner of an insurance company, and Ellen Schoonover, their mother, is a stay-at-home mom and part-time consultant. But then go through some description and then say, Matt had gone to college and then came home. By the time he came home, he had become a functioning addict, using opiate prescription painkillers and Percocet above all. From there, he moved eventually to OxyContin, a powerful pill made by a small company in the state of Connecticut called Purdue Pharma.
Mm-hmm.
In early 2012, his parents found out. They were worried. But the pills Matt had been abusing were pharmaceuticals prescribed by a doctor. They weren't street drugs that you could die from, or so they believed. They took him to the doctor, who prescribed a week-long detoxification using blood pressure and sleep medicine to calm the symptoms of opiate withdrawal. He relapsed a short time later. Took him to another rehab, then let him take the car to go to a Narcotics Anonymous, and the next morning they got a call that he was dead. And this is repeated over and over and over again in the central part of the United States in particular, but across the United States, that these drugs that were produced by legal pharmaceuticals that were prescribed by doctors ended up killing, where's that map again?
First one?
Yeah. Tens and hundreds of thousands of people. And then it went from there, but I will I'll go back to that in a minute.
The new those numbers.
700,000 deaths in 18 years from 1999.
Mexico 75.6.
West Virginia 49.5. What is that?
And what's the gray? What are the colors?
You're asking me about something that I just got by internet, but casualties per 100,000, or is it million? What's it? 1, 2, 3.
No, it's gotta be one.
Deaths per 100,000 persons.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, less than 29 is white. 29, I'm sorry, less than 19 is white. 19 to 25 is light blue. 25 to 35 is darker blue. And the darkest blue is 35 to 60, and black is 60 plus.
Down there.
And gray is nothing.
Yeah, that brownish gray. Yeah. Apparently, so I was wrong on that. I was thinking it meant.
There is no danger.
700,000. 700,000. Yeah.
Still, West Virginia, the epicenter of this problem, is largely rural and not particularly heavily populated.
That's true.
Yeah.
What else do they have to do?
Well, they used to work in coal mines.
Yeah.
They used to be productive workers. And that's part of the story. So let me see. I'm just trying to. Then he goes on to discuss what he found out, just in general terms. Crime was at a historic low. Drug overdose deaths were at record highs. A happy facade covering a disturbing reality. I grew consumed in this story. It was about America and Mexico, about addictions and marketing, about wealth and poverty, about happiness and how to achieve it. I saw it as an epic woven by threads from all over. It took me through the history of pain and the revolution in U.S. medicine. I followed the tale through a small town of sugarcane farmers in Nayarit, Mexico, and a town of equal size in the Rust Belt of southern Ohio. The story transported one through Appalachian Kentucky and the gleaming suburbs of the cities that had benefited most from our age of excess that began in the late 1990s. I met cops and addicts, professors and doctors, public health nurses and pharmacists as I tried to follow the threads. And he ends by saying he met with those parents, the Schoonovers, whose son Matt had died. And Paul Schoonover, the father, says, I kept trying to figure out what had just happened. Why did our lives become so devastated? How could this have happened? And he says, here's how. Now, you have
Lights?
lights, camera. You have on, by the way, one of the things that struck me when I started reading this book, how many people had, or what, do people know much about OxyContin? Anybody here very familiar with it? Okay. Is that because of personal pain or just because you've heard about it?
No, I read Deborah Freeman's article about the history of the incredible crimes of Purdue Pharmaceutical in the EIR.
The drugging was,
I had friends in college who were addicted to it.
I had never heard of it. When the first time I heard about it was when Rush Limbaugh was arrested. You know? And there was this big scandal, and I thought, and it gives you an idea of how the problem with the way people that, you know, I was just trying to convey from what these parents were saying, which is, I thought, what's the big deal? I mean, the guy's a jerk, but it's, you know, a pharmaceutical drug. How bad could it have been, you know, to abuse a pharmaceutical drug? What's the big deal? That was my first reaction. You know, yeah, Joan.
When I was telling Keisha in the car, like we had coming up Quaaludes, Dilaudid, Novocaine, I mean, you name it. That was very prevalent in the Northeast. Believe me,
But this
Yeah.
OxyContin is a whole big
it's a whole different
jump,
jump, but it's
further into hell. Yeah, it's true. It comes
on.
on. But I mean, you know, this is one of the things that they played on was that kind of you know, that kind of mentality. Well, it's a prescription drug, you know, what's the big deal? And even I responded that way. Can we go to the map of the U.S., the other one?
Yeah.
This is a map, which is in the beginning of the Sam Quinones book, Dreamland. And if you see these little stars and then also circles, those are areas where the black tar heroin was being sold by a group of young farm boys from Mexico. Now, I'll come back to this in a minute, but one of the centers of where this all started was a place called Portsmouth, Ohio. And if there was ever a typical American city, in fact, Portsmouth, Ohio, which is here. Portsmouth, Ohio was declared an all-American city on the list of all-American cities given an award twice, 1979, and 1980. But by the time they got their second award, the steel mill that had been one of the major factories was being closed down. Could somebody turn the lights on again? Because it's hard to see what I've put in yellow. With that. Hold on a second. I shall find it. Maybe I won't. Oh, here it is. This is just a little bit of the history. Portsmouth was listed in the early part of the 20th century as being a major industrial center, the fourth largest shoe manufacturing center in the country, and the largest manufacturer of fire and paving bricks in the United States. Wheeling Pittsburgh Steel later became Empire Detroit Steel, employed over 1,000 people. There were 100 other manufacturing companies producing goods from furniture to engines. So, and this is across the river from West Virginia. Partly in answer to your question, Joanne, people were working in the coal mines, they were working in the factories. The city population peaked at over 40,000 in 1940. But during the later 20th century, foreign competition and industrial restructuring resulted in the loss of most of the industrial jobs on which Portsmouth economy had been based. Jobs were moved out of the area, with many going overseas. And then by 10 years later, when they were receiving their award as an all-American city in 1980, Empire's Detroit Steel Portsmouth Works was closed. That was 1,300 jobs. So the people in the city were left with nothing. They were left in poverty with no manufacturing, with no idea of doing anything to be able to, that they were in any way useful and needed for the future. There we are. And into that climate, what you had happen was the beginnings of a campaign to market drugs. Now, I'll ask another question. You remember when you first started seeing on television, ads for this wonderful drug, whatever it is, that you don't know what it does, but you really need it, and go down to your doctor?
And 2 minutes of caveats, thoughts of suicide.
Yeah, right.
Lady standing by the water.
Yeah, right. You really, really need this. Well, is Arthur Sackler the next guy? Yep, there he is. This is the guy that started all that.
Oh, wow.
Okay. This guy is named Arthur Sackler. And he was an ad man in New York City. And he came up with the idea that they could go directly to doctors. He could send salesmen directly to doctors and convince them that they needed various kinds of prescription drugs, that they could put ads in medical magazines, that they could put ads on TV and radio, that they could, even develop their own magazines and get them out to doctors. And so you had the beginnings of an onslaught against doctors, that they needed these medicines.
What year was this?
He started in the 1960s, but it started really escalating in the 1980s. He died in 1987. But shortly before that or after that, his two brothers bought a pharmaceutical company called Purdue Pharma. Yeah.
Is that same for people that make the chicken?
No.
No.
It's spelled the same way.
The same people that make the OxyContin.
Yeah, they make the OxyContin. They're the ones, that make the OxyContin. And so what else was happening at that time? If you have to deal with pain, and when you're dealing with veterans from the military, when you're dealing with people who are industrial workers, when you're dealing with sports stars, you're dealing with a lot of pain problems. Now, does anybody want to guess what the most important element for a serious treatment of pain would be? The most important element in treating pain.
Physical therapy.
Distraction.
Opiates.
Mental attitude.
It's a little bit of everything except for the opiates, you may use, but you need time. If you've ever known anyone that's had a pain problem, it takes an enormous amount of time for doctors to figure out what's going on. And there were serious programs. I'm happy to say, since I'm from Washington State, that one of the most serious pain clinics was actually put together at the University of Washington. And they had people come in for several months worth of not treatment of here's a pill, go home, and if it doesn't work, come back and we'll give you a whole bunch more, which is what became the alternative. But they actually had physical therapy, psychological therapy, discussions of diet and exercise and all kinds of things. So it was an overall multidisciplinary program in dealing with pain, of which opioids were a small part, but only a small part. If you're, you go to work in between when you're exercising and eating right. But this was I don't want to just say effective, but it was a useful attempt to actually solve the problem. And at one point, there were over 1,000 of those kinds of clinics across the country. Pain management clinics, yeah. But what became called pain management clinics became pill mills, because there was a big problem, which was insurance companies would not pay for all that time to be put into patients. It is now the case that, according to some studies, the average doctor should have about 1,800 patients per doctor per year. The average is now somewhere like 2,300 and as many as 3,000. The average visit with a doctor is under 13 minutes. Now, in that time, you can you can have somebody tell you what kind of pain they have and then write them a prescription for some kind of opiate, but that's about all you could do. There's very little less, and the insurance company simply wouldn't pay for it. So the number of the multidisciplinary clinics went down from 1,000 to about 85. And this is going from what was set up in the early 80s into the end of the 1990s. You had this guy and his family and his acolytes, pushing the idea of selling these drugs to the doctors who were desperate because they needed them. And most of the people who were making these diagnoses were general practitioners who knew very little about pain. But they were being sold these pharmaceuticals and then, pushed on them. So you had this going on in the 1980s and 1990s. Vicodin and, various of the other kinds of drugs that Joanne was talking about, were initially used. But the problem that kept coming up that worried doctors tremendously was, aren't these prescriptions that include opioids, aren't they addictive? Well, there were two campaigns that were launched to deal with that. One was a campaign by Big Pharma and also some research facilities starting in England and also in the United States to say, if you have, the way opioids were first used, I should go back, they were almost exclusively used for post-surgery or, an injury, short term, but not, post-surgery and childbirth. That's what they were used for. And that was it. And doctors would not prescribe them otherwise because they were known to be addictive. Mm-hmm. And when there started to be a push to prescribe them otherwise, the doctors rebelled and said, we can't do this. We've been trained that you do not prescribe opioids. Well, there was an answer to that, which was, well, there's a difference between prescribing opioids for somebody who's just been through surgery and only has temporary pain and somebody who has long-term pain. Because you see, and you can read the detail, I'm not going to go through all the details of this, but because you see the argument went, the pain counteracts the euphoria effects of the opioids, and therefore it's guaranteed to not be addictive. And this is coming from doctors and scientific institutes. They went to the point where they used what did they call it? A research thesis or something of that sort, which said that only 1% of people who were taking opiates had gotten addicted. And there was such a quote unquote research study, but it wasn't a research study. It was a 1-paragraph letter from a doctor in Boston named Dr. Jick, J-I-C-K, who had become interested in the effects of using opioids in the hospital. And did that, end up with the people getting them being addicted. So he asked for some statistics, and the statistics that he got showed him that in the case under hospital supervision, in a very careful situation, 1% of people still got addicted. And he wrote a letter to the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine and said that. This is in 1979.
That's not a study. That's not a study.
It became one. In all of the this was referred to by the salesman. The salesman for these various opioids were taught that they were trained that what you tell the doctors is that there's a study. Everybody knows that only 1% of people who take opioids get addicted. They don't have to worry.
Evelyn?
Yeah.
Opioids, are they synthetic? They're not derived from opium, but they're synthetic opium?
I think opioid refers to the term both natural and synthetic. They say synthetic opioids, for
So they
things like
effectively manufacture a
You-
surrogate opium in a laboratory.
or you distill it from something else, and so that it's a more general term, and it covers morphine, it covers heroin, it covers opium, it covers all these different kinds of prescription pills and stuff like that. But it's all addictive, and it was known to be addictive, but people were being trapped. Now, one of the things that Paul Gallagher, who wrote an article on this, mentioned was that the desperation of people's economically was used to actually spread this stuff. In towns in Appalachia, seniors were able to buy these opioids with their Medicare, with their Medicare coverage, and they didn't need it all. So they sold it to their grandkids in high school who either used it or sold it, which they did, not because they wanted to destroy their grandkids, but because they couldn't live on their Social Security. So the economics and the quote unquote, science of this thing, intersect all the time. It's not one or the other, but you have both. The other thing that was done was to change the practice of medicine in hospitals in particular, so that pain and the treatment, the idea was put forward in various medical schools and research papers, quote unquote research papers and other things, that having pain was an intolerable condition for a human being, and that everything had to be done to end pain. And as one person in here says, with most prescriptions, if the doctor gives you a prescription, you take it and your condition gets worse, you come back, the doctor does not give you more of the same prescription. But when it came to these opioids, that's exactly what happened. If people came in, and first of all, how do you measure pain? The idea was also put forward that pain should be considered what they called the fifth vital sign. That is, you have
in the hospital right now.
yeah, right. You have a blood pressure, what is it, and heart rate, and pulse, and temperature, whatever, and now, and what's the other one?
Respiration.
Yeah.
You're
Respiration. Now those can be measured, right?
Yeah.
How do you measure pain?
You ask the patient, 1 to 10.
Yeah. I guess. Yeah, and with kids, that's how they do it. Yes, how do you ask a child? You have smiley face, crying face, and in between faces, and you ask them, so that emojis basically, and what happened was that this thing was driven to the point, and I don't want to try and go through all the details. Maybe I could say a few more about some of it if people ask, but there's a huge amount of details, and that's why I say read the book. But the doctors started being judged by their patients on how effectively they were treating them. The hospitals started being judged by their patients on how they were treating them. There is something called, and this is the article that Craig was referring to, I think, right? By Debbie Freeman, The Drugging of Americans is Deliberate.
Mm-hmm.
And there is an institution called the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations. It's the most powerful accreditation institution in the world. It's headquartered in a Chicago suburb. It's a nonprofit organization, and it sets standard of care for hospitals in this country, accrediting more than 20,000 facilities in all but 4 states. It is tasked with inspecting hospitals, ensuring adequate care is being given and standards are being met. It also issues directive for care. In 2001, the pharmaceutical lobby, led by the Sacklers, he died in 1987, but he had 2 brothers who kept this thing going. They spent just under $100 million in lobbying efforts. So the Joint Commission issued a new directive to its more than 20,000 hospitals across the country. it is time to start treating pain. And then they sent in representatives to help train the people in the hospitals on how to effectively treat pain. Well, who was brought in to do the training? Representatives of Purdue Pharma, the Sackler family's company, and the producers of OxyContin. And the hospitals were told they would be sued or lose their accreditation if they were not getting satisfactory ratings from the patients on, the way they were dealing with pain. Doctors were told they could lose their license, they could lose their accreditation if they weren't, if this wasn't being carried out in a way satisfactory to the patients and satisfactory to, the powers that be. Now, think about this. Starting then in the early 2000s, the point we are now, you have the beginnings of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. There have now been approximately 3 million people serving, in those wars. In the military, the figures are 60% of those returning from deployments in the Middle East and 50% of older veterans suffer from chronic pain. That's as compared to 30% of the population in general. Prescription opioids spiked by 270% over 12 years from 2001 to 2013. And the possibility of veterans dying from an accidental opioid overdose was twice that of non-veterans. So, this is developing. Now, there was a problem. You had pill mills being set up. Would you go back to that map with the first map?
The first one.
Mm-hmm. In these areas, West Virginia, Southern Ohio, Kentucky, parts of Tennessee, this was coal mining area. You had the coal mines being shut down, people going on welfare, not being able to, what he documents here is in the coal mining areas, what had happened a lot is that someone would work in the coal mines till they were about 45 years old, and then often come down with black lung disease. And then they would be put on a disability stipend, so that from that time on, they had disability stipend plus a Social Security SSI, and got about $2,000 a month on which to maintain their families, which they could do. When the coal mines started being closed down in the 1990s and the early 2000s, you no longer had that disability money being available to these workers because they hadn't been working. They were just getting SSI. They were getting about $500 a month. Now, at that point, that intersected the pushing on the part of Arthur Sackler and parts of the medical profession of the idea that it was, you had to treat pain, you had to get these medicines, these prescriptions that would solve the pain problem out. And in these areas, you had the Medicare cards, the Medicaid cards available to people to go buy these prescriptions. And they started, there was, in the town of Portsmouth, which I started out with, the one that had 1,000 or 100 different industries, before they were all shut down. At one point, there was one pill mill for every 1,800 residents. And these pill mills, he describes them, these are doctor's offices, supposedly, but they're doctor's offices which from before dawn have lines of people who are there. They order pizza, they bring their food, they bring their entertainment. They're waiting in lines of hundreds and thousands of people to get in to see a doctor for a couple of minutes, get a prescription for the opioids and, for OxyContin or for Vicodin or for one of these, and then what they would often do was use half of them and sell part of them. Sometimes they couldn't afford to pay for getting the prescription filled, so they would go to somebody who could take their Medicare card because they were out of work and got SSI and couldn't live on that, who needed the money from selling it. So a whole economy, instead of an economy of producing coal, producing steel, producing shoes, producing various things, you had a pill mill economy being created. And this is in the hundreds and thousands and millions. There, let me see if I can find the numbers here because I had them down. They're really stunning. Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't know where I have the, but you're talking about millions and millions and millions of pills. Rush Limbaugh, who I was mentioning, when he was busted, he had gotten 2,000 pills in 6 months from 4 pharmacies. Huh?
Does he still have his liver?
You can buy a new liver too.
I don't think he has his heart, but I don't know about his liver.
Not much brain either.
Yeah. But, this thing became massive. And then there became a problem. What the other line was that the toleration is not going to increase for this OxyContin, for these opioids. And that was another falsehood. So that as people kept taking them, they would start with 20 milligrams or 40 milligrams or 80 milligrams. They got up to 160 milligrams, 300 milligrams. This stuff cost about $1 a milligram. So if you're up to a 200 to 300 milligram a day,
because you tolerate it.
Yeah, because your tolerance is going up. Yeah. So what do you do? Can't afford it. You go to other kind of drugs. Now that brings in the other country whose economy had been ruined by the policies of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and that's called Mexico. And at the same time that this whole, the United States industrial economy was shutting down, the drugs were being pushed as prescription drugs. The whole idea that you had to defeat pain, that there was no such thing as addiction, all these big lies were being used. You had NAFTA passed, and NAFTA went into effect on January 1st, 1994. Here's what it did to the farmers in Mexico. When NAFTA was being negotiated, 3 million producers, or 40% of all Mexicans working in agriculture, were cultivating corn. Mexico's borders opened 10 years ahead of schedule to allow cheaper imports of corn and beans from the US and Canada. As a result, poor small farmers who produced for the local market were forced to compete with cheaper imports. Now listen to this figure. For those who did not lose their jobs, the monthly income for self-employed farmers fell from 1,959 pesos, almost 2,000 pesos in 1991, to 12 years later in 2003, 228 pesos. Now, that is also something that you can't live on. I'm sure it was very difficult to live on 1,959 pesos a month, much less 228. So you had a labor force for the drug trade. And I don't know, and he doesn't say who and how exactly, but somebody came up with an idea that actually fit like hand in glove with this whole prescription drug pill mill stuff. And that was, if you want to sell heroin to wealthy or well-off middle-class people, they're not likely to come down to the ghetto or the rough part of town to try and buy it. That your market is going to be much, much smaller if you enforce that. But what if you can deliver it to them like pizza delivery? And that's what they started to do. The heroin that was being sold in these areas, and also in parts of LA, in Reno, in Salt Lake City, in Portland, number of cities. Where's that map, Mike? Yeah, the other one.
Denver and Colorado Springs.
Yeah, Denver. Yeah.
Well, Texas is not, there's nothing in Texas, right?
Not of that particular operation. Right.
It's kind of strange because it's right next to Mexico.
Well, see, anywhere where there was already a major market and where somebody was already selling the drugs, they didn't move into. Because you're talking about, what they did was they took, 18 to 20-year-old farm boys from rural Mexico, from Nayarit, Mexico, hired them to come up. They didn't use the drugs. They didn't have weapons.
Hmm.
They set them up in apartments with old cars, some, old inconspicuous cars. They mostly didn't speak English.
Hmm.
And they then brought in black tar heroin, which is the kind that's just boiled down. It's apparently grown in the hills above Nayarit, Mexico, down here.
Hmm.
And they didn't want to, since they didn't want to get into, any kind of violent, fights over it. They didn't go to New York. They didn't go to Philadelphia. They didn't go to Texas. They
Texas
didn't go
was
to this.
already occupied by the
Yeah.
cartels. Yeah.
Exactly. They went to other places like Portsmouth, Ohio, and Columbus, Ohio, and various parts of Kentucky and West Virginia and other places. And there would be a guy in charge of the cell, a dispatcher, and also in charge of packaging very tiny little amounts of black tar heroin, which they would put in little plastic bags. And then these young farm boys from Mexico would put them in their mouth and then go out driving around to deliver the heroin. Now, the way that they knew where to deliver was they would, and here's another interesting thing in terms of what we've been fighting all these years. They looked for existing addicts who they could get their heroin to and pass out a card which had a phone number on it. Basically said, if you need help, call this number, I think is how they put it. And then the addicts would call the number and then order a certain amount of heroin. The driver, this is at the point before cell phones, so they were using beepers, and they would send out they would signal them on a beeper, and they had codes that would be the code for a couple of main streets and this far north of it and this far west of it and whatever, and go out and meet at a McDonald's or something, the customer, and then drive to a more secluded place, spit out the amount of heroin that they wanted in these little packages, take the money, and then drive off, and the person would drive home, and use their heroin. That's how it operated. Now, you started having more and more people involved in this, and they needed more customers. So they found out that the place to go was methadone clinics.
Mhm.
We've been fighting against this question, because one of the tales that Quinones tells is that there has been for the last least century and a half, maybe more, a kind of search for the Holy Grail, which is finding a opioid painkiller that is non-addictive. And there's been all kinds of research, and there have been all kinds of things put forward, like with OxyContin, which is very strong and very addictive. The thing that they claimed was that it was time released. Not only was it the pain that would prevent the euphoria from taking over and addicting you, but also since it was time released, you would never get enough of it to be able to be addicted. With methadone apparently, according to Quinones, and I'm no expert for sure, but he says that with methadone, you don't have the highs and lows that you have with heroin or opium or OxyContin or some of these other things. It's more even, the effect that it has on you. So remember the way methadone clinics were sold and methadone was sold was the idea that you could, people could work and lead a normal life and, not have to, they couldn't, since we all know.
Methadone is addictive, right?
Hmm? Oh, yeah, it's totally addictive. But the idea was people are addicted and you're not going to be able to do anything about it. So give them an addiction that they can live with. Well, once again, insurance companies came into the play because there were two approaches to how you should use methadone. One was that you should get people on a dose of methadone that was fairly high if they were already an addict, and then gradually decrease them until you got them off methadone. But that was actually much less, prevalent than the other idea, which was that you should bring people down to a maintenance dose, which they could then operate. They could live their lives. They could, keep functioning. Yeah, Diane.
You remember what it was called initially?
Dolphin.
A dolphin, right? Yeah. You know, and
After him.
It was made.
A dolphin.
Yeah, Demerol was invented by the Nazis too.
yes, a dolphin, yes.
Wow.
But the problem was once again, just like the pain clinics, the idea was to combine it with all kinds of counseling and follow up. Well, that also costs money. And these programs, I guess a lot of them started out government, but then they began to be taken over by private companies. And the private companies were in it to make money. So they were giving the addicts low doses of methadone, which was not enough to actually prevent their cravings. And so you had a situation where, they were giving them no counseling because that cost too much money. So just have the addicts come in, get their, dose of methadone, and go home and assume that everything was okay. Well, that's how methadone clinics became the place that if you wanted to find potential customers for heroin, that's where you went. And so the Nayarit farm boys were trained to go down to the methadone clinics or find a junkie who would tell them where the methadone clinics were, and then hand out their cards that said, they would give out samples, and then they would hand out these cards that said where to call, and had an increasing number of, they had an increasing number of heroin addicts from that. And if you combine those two things, the methadone clinics, but also people who had been on OxyContin, like the young man that I started with his story, young man who was a student who had some problems, who got onto, painkillers, or there are innumerable stories in here of athletes. The other thing is, once you take away from people any kind of productive lifestyle so that you don't have any goal, you're not raising your kids to be part of building a nation, doing something productive, then the only thing they can do that makes them feel worthwhile is be a sports star. Or if you're a girl, be a cheerleader, but the sports became a substitute for something productive. Well, but then question of playing through pain started becoming stronger and stronger need to be able to do that. And the more money, how much did they spend on the Katy stadium that they built a few years ago? $10 million or something like that. 55 million, whatever. There's a story in here about a stadium someplace in the Midwest where they put all this money into a stadium, and in the first year, the star quarterback got injured, and the team and the coach were determined that they were going to have a winning year because they had just put all the money into the stadium. And so, of course, started just about everybody by the end of the year, was on drugs of some sort in order to try. And they ended up only winning 3 games anyway, so it didn't work. But, this is the sad and, pathetic, kind of society that was vulnerable to this massive spread of drugs. Now, can you go to the tanks down State Street one? People can read these later, and I only have, so if you're going to see me later after this, then don't take one. But if you're going to be heading home, then take one. It's a history of LaRouche's war on drugs. It's a 25-year history of LaRouche's war on drugs from 1995. In other words, Mark.
Just a quick note on performance-enhancing drugs. Sports have always been prone to this. There was a known proclivity for performance-enhancing drugs. Strychnine used to be used as a performance-enhancing drugs in the early days of the 20th century.
Is that where they got the idea of knocking them dead?
Strychnine.
But this wasn't performance enhancing drugs you're dealing with in this case.
This is allow them
This
to
is
play while
playing
they're in,
despite
would they otherwise be in agony?
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
yeah.
You know, but during this whole period where this was all developing, you had the LaRouche organization. As I said, you can look at this later, but this is from 1995. LaRouche was right for 20 years on the war on drugs. This is a picture from 1986.
86.
And this is Janice Hart, who had shocked the world by becoming the official Democratic Party nominee for Secretary of State in the state of Illinois in the spring of 1986. And part of her campaign was, we're going to carry out a relentless war on drugs and shut down the drug trade, even if we have to take tanks down State Street in Chicago to do it. And after she won the nomination, she and a military supporter by the name of Robert Patton, apparently no relation to George Patton as far as we know, actually did drive a tank down State Street in Chicago. This was after we had put together in Illinois, that's a young Lyndon LaRouche, in case you don't recognize him over there on the right, speaking to a Illinois anti-drug coalition meeting. The LaRouche organization founded the anti-drug coalition in 1979. And do we have the next one? Before Reagan was even elected president of the United States, or Nancy Reagan was going around talking about just say no, and the term war on drugs then got perverted by George H.W. Bush into just locking up, you know, every user that there was. The term war on drugs was developed by the LaRouche organization. And we had a magazine which came out from June 1980 till November 1981. It probably would have come out longer than that, except for that it was closed down by the Illinois Attorney General based on complaints from the Anti-Defamation League and Dennis King, who was a writer for the magazine called High Times, which was the pro-drug lobby.
It's still around,
What, High Times?
unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, you know, but they closed down, you know, our publication, you know, the war on drugs. The next one. We had tables like that in 16 states and 5 countries, you know, around the world. Pot smokers can't remember the brains they've lost. You know, we were out there fighting. While we were doing that, we published 3 editions of this book, Dope Incorporated. The first one was called Britain's Opium War Against the U.S. It was published in December of 1978. Then in April of 1986, Dope Incorporated, Boston Bankers and Soviet Commissars. As you can tell, it was a bit expanded. And then in spring of 1992, I think Lynn was still in jail, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We published this one, Dope Inc., the bank that drove Henry Kissinger crazy. And
The book.
The book.
The book.
the bank, yeah, well, bank really drove it someplace else, but yes, the book that drove Henry Kissinger crazy. So, and when you read through, I won't try and go through, but when you read through the 20-year history, just from the first 20 years of our fight against drugs, you will see us in the middle of publishing the material on how the banks, you know, basically going through what was the technology needed to be able to shut down drug production, which exists. You can, you know, think about all the drones and all the, you know, you can observe anything these days. You can find where drugs are being grown. The opium that's being turned into black tar heroin and sold across the United States could be cleaned up very, very rapidly. Any of these drug operations can be cleaned up very rapidly if there's a commitment to do it. And we went, you know, we've been on the front edge of that. But what really is the key to the whole thing was actually discussed by Sam Quinones when he spoke to the, which is one of the reasons I like him. If I can find the article that I'm looking for now, Hold on a second.
Keep the light on.
Yeah, probably help. Probably help to find it. Here it is. Okay. Sam Quinones' book became very famous, and this one, the Dreamland book.
Oh, okay.
And he was invited to testify to the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions on January 9th, 2018. And it's very interesting what he had to say, because he not only went through some of what I've gone through and what he goes through in his book, but he made clear that just going after the drugs was not enough. And I'll read you what he had to say. He says, view this as an opportunity to revive those regions hammered by globalization and free trade. This is the author of the book on drugs. The roots of our national epidemic of narcotics addiction lie here, while the epidemic itself, in turn, stands in the way of their revival. I believe American history offers us two templates for action from which you might take guidance and inspiration. The first is the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. The second is our space program. Each involved government and the private sector acting in concert over many years, bringing money, brains, energy, and of course, long-term focus to bear. Each achieved an unalloyed good for our country, although they were both things that seemed at first blush far beyond our own short-term self-interest. Marshall Plan was about building up ravaged regions to allow them to function independently. Through our space program, we were inspired as a people to spend years and dollars, all to achieve something no previous generation had ever thought possible. We ended up far beyond the moon. The spillover in economic benefit, increase in knowledge, and human inspiration is beyond calculation. It seems to me that we might profitably apply these examples, the Marshall Plan and the space program, to regions of forgotten Americans, where this addiction problem began. Let's do it, not because it's easy, but as JFK said, because it is hard. Because that's what Americans do and have always done at their greatest. Like our space program, I believe such an effort will have to last for years to be effective, focused beyond the immediate goal of drug addiction and on the more profound problems of community destruction and the hollowing out stretches of this country. It offers an opportunity to reinvest in areas that need it most, a chance to inspire us as Americans again. Do not miss this opportunity. It does not come around often. You will be remembered for acting when acting was not easy to do. Unfortunately, in 2 full rounds of questioning to him on that January 9th hearing, involving 18 committee members, many with his book in front of them, and many speaking at length as senators will do, no one even mentioned his 2 big ideas. So it's up to American citizens, which brings me back to that first quote from Elliot Roosevelt, that it's what American citizens do that is going to determine whether or not we defeat the drug plague and whether we defeat the causes of it in the destruction of our economy. And we've never had a better moment in which to be able to do that. So that now is the time for LaRouche's 4 laws. That's what I wanted to present.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question and to make a point. I'll make the point first, which is there's a number of us here from Chicago, so
So you were taking the tanks down State Street.
yeah, and the reason State Street is because that is the financial district, right? Which is a major point in terms of stopping drugs. If they can't put the money through the banking system, they can't use it. Right, so the money laundering thing is the first round. I mean, if you do that, you're way ahead of the game. And the second question I wanted to ask is about the Nayarit boys. Do we know who organized that? Does he say who organized that?
No, he makes it appear as if it's an extended group of families, some of whom got the idea originally and then started bringing in their their family members.
Sounds like a George Soros operation.
Yeah. Yeah, Mark.
I just have a quick note about article in Esquire magazine that noted the pernicious influence of marijuana legalization. Apparently, these drug networks that formerly dealt in marijuana are out of business with the legalization in certain parts of the United States. So, having these networks in place, they just changed over their product, which is now heroin. And
It's like what happened when alcohol.
And they're selling it to the users of the legalized marijuana.
exactly, yeah.
Boy, Ian?
Well, we can legalize heroin.
That'd solve the whole thing.
Yeah. Take care of everybody.
Legalize
Well,
it,
remember, Jimmy Carter appointed a drug advisor who proposed the legalization of heroin. I don't know if you remember that, and I hadn't until I started looking back at some of the articles on this stuff. But we had a president of the United States who had a drug advisor who proposed legalizing heroin nationally.
So I've heard that the too big to fail banks basically could not continue to operate without the drug money laundering going through the Fed. And we're talking about pill mill economies. Do you have any clue about how much money is being funneled through this addiction economy?
Trillions.
Like, actually not just throwing out random numbers, but actual, is there any?
No, I don't. I mean, I tried to read as much as I could, and I was looking for this thing I had, but I was,
I had one of the.
okay, hold on a second. Well, I can't find it, but remember the UN anti-drug czar Costa, who said in the late 1980s, I believe it was, and I don't know where I put the article that had the quotes from him, but he said that basically by the 1990s, the banks would not have survived without the drug money. The only available source of liquidity for the banks, by the late 1980s was the drug money. He didn't say how much. When you think about it, when you're talking about, trillions and quadrillions of dollars of derivatives and things, you're talking about a lot of money. We had put out in these books, when we put them out, we put out figures, but this is 20 some years ago.
Okay, so that's interesting. The other question I had is the big thing that everybody's talking about in terms of opioids these days is fentanyl. But, microgram can kill you in an instant, and there was that stuff seems to be, at least from what I've read in the news, coming from China through various, I don't know if there's a specific place.
Precursor chemicals mostly.
And so, and then I've heard, do you have an update in terms of, because I remember hearing something in passing about Trump discussing that with Xi Jinping.
Yeah, and he got an
crack
agreement
down
from-
on that.
Yeah, he got an agreement from Xi Jinping to crack down on it.
Do you know anything beyond
Beyond
what
that,
that means, or?
Well,
no, but I was just,
let me say something on that. I can
Yeah.
just help answer that. First of all, China already outlaws fentanyl and already outlaws dozens of precursors to making fentanyl. So the whole idea that China was the source of the whole fentanyl problem, was partly bogus to begin with. Secondly, with a population of 1.3 billion people, they've got their problems, with organized crime and so forth themselves. They do a pretty good job with it, but I mean, it always pops up. But then, yes, there was the agreement reached between Trump and Xi in the context of the Buenos Aires summit. And so that's proceeding. But it's just important to keep in mind the whole media attack on China as being the source of fentanyl was trumped up to begin with. Not by Trump.
Kind of like saying that Mexico is the source of black tar heroin because it happened to be located there.
Well, yeah, and it comes from other places too. It's not like China's the only source.
and one thing, this is another thing I didn't realize. I mean, this is a learning process for me too. I read this book twice, by the way. It's really and this was something that Sherry on one of our conference calls said, and I hadn't realized it before. I started hearing about fentanyl in relation to heroin and how deadly it is. And by the way, this, which is from the DEA, says that fentanyl is 50 times more potent than morphine and 100 times more potent than heroin. So it is very strong stuff. Was first developed in 1959 and was introduced in the 1960s as an intravenous anesthetic. So it was actually, so it was actually developed for medical
And
use.
they give it to you right now in the hospital.
It's still used.
Yeah. So a lot of these things, were developed for medical use, but the abuse was set up by the very, some of the very institutions that developed it. That's the thing that's so horrifying about it. It's not like, people just started overusing it, at random. This thing was an operation to lie to the doctors and lie to the public and use all the financial and political pressure to enforce a massive expansion. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Can I go back to your first one? This is Antonio Maria Costa, Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. In an interview published on January 27, 2009, and then on his website this is also from his website a little bit earlier. And he says, the drug trade could be the only growth industry with little unemployment. He said, greedy banks have taken in and hidden this blood money. Complex financial institutions have made financial markets deliberately less transparent and more accessible to wrongdoing. Thanks to bankers, accountants, and lawyers, criminal groups have become multinational corporations, a sort of mafia borghese or white-collar syndicate. Today, the financial crisis is providing an extraordinary opportunity for even greater mafia penetration of cash-strapped financial houses. With the banking crisis choking lending, these cash-rich criminal groups have emerged as the only sources of credit. And Brian had found something about $352 billion.
In a 2009 article.
What year was that?
This is 2009.
2009.
So this is coming off the 2008
Yeah.
crisis.
Well, then, I mean,
How much
luckily
is
the Federal Reserve created a new source of liquidity for the banks called quantitative easing, right? Right, bailout.
Anyway, Ian had another question.
The only last thing was that you talked about Congress being bought and paid for by folks. Do we have identified members of Congress where they're like getting all this campaign money from Purdue Pharma and that? Where is there a way to identify? Like,
I don't know, and he
even
doesn't
worth
see
doing?
the thing that Quinones focuses on is not the Congress, but the doctors. Because yeah. I mean, so the other thing, as I remember, and I don't remember the details of it, and I didn't find anything going back on this, maybe somebody else does, that there was a move to actually to prosecute some of these pill mill operations, because it was it's obvious if you've got, a few thousand people in a town and you're selling millions of pills, that it ain't just a prescription, situation that you're dealing with. And it was under the Obama administration. I don't know if you remember, I'm sure anybody, and there was the move to shut it down, which was then undercut.
So the thing I wanted to point out is, again, I mean, to underscore the deliberate nature of this thing, because, I mean, if you think about the timing of all of this, one of the things that's implied by what you were saying, but I just wanted to make it more explicit, is the fact that the the transition to the managed care health system was the vehicle by which all of this was able to take place. I mean, then that started under Nixon in 74 or 73, when he passed 72, 73, whatever the year was, that he actually pushed through the beginning of managed care. Because, not only did that drive the medical practitioner into, a more and more progressively superficial relationship with their patient, and more narrowly focused on immediate results, but it also prohibited long-term complex treatment approaches, to solving problems, multiple disciplinary approaches, which are the only way, that you successfully solve many problems, with patients. I mean, in any area of disease. And so, I mean, the medical system, I think it's a mistake not to attack the Congress on this thing because they brought this in. Whereas, the biggest problem with the doctors is that they didn't fight Washington, fight back.
I understand that it wasn't
Yeah.
Washington that they were fighting. Yes, it's true that the whole managed care thing, was rotten and it came from Nixon and stuff.
Yeah.
Starting that period. But this whole the thing that horrified me is it's bad enough to have a corrupt policy coming out of Washington, but to have a corrupt policy coming out of the people that you should be able to turn to for some policy advice on these kinds of things. And instead of them trying to.
You mean like the pharmaceutical companies?
The pharmaceutical companies, the researchers, there's a whole now huge pain, what do they call it? Pain lobby or pain medicine, they set up all kinds of different organizations for pain, relief and pain care and lobbying and, demanding, and that was done through the pharmaceuticals especially. But then what they would do was, one of the things they did was sponsor continuing medical education, which doctors have to get, they have to have a certain number of hours in continuing medical education to keep their license or whatever. And these would be run by Purdue Pharma, or there are a number of Sloan Kettering was in the middle of this. There's an institute in Salt Lake City, whose name I don't remember, that was in the middle of this. There was a hospice operation in London, where this stuff came from, all pushing the idea that having pain is intolerable. So, which gets me back to this thing of what, my quotes from Lyndon LaRouche and, Bertrand Russell, that a human being is not just an animal where you've got to seek pleasure and avoid pain, but that is the whole assumption behind the whole way this pain was treated, not to solve, and it's true, the Congress is rotten, but it's just so easy for people to say, people who've gone along with this stuff, grandparents who sold drugs to their kids to make enough money to live on, parents who got their kids using drugs because they want them to be a, high school football star. And the other thing that he has a big emphasis on in here is nobody would talk about the heroin deaths in these middle-class communities. No one would talk about it because it was too embarrassing.
I mean, look, at my brother, who happens to do some epidemiological studies, for NIH, what are they focused on? They're focused on gun deaths, right? These kinds of things. And I keep sending him emails, what about the drug, I mean, this is like 5 years ago. What about the drug deaths? And I'd send all the statistics I could find online and send them over to him, right? Just ignore that stuff. The big focus is on, whatever the.
But for parents to be more, you had some parents who finally would come out and tell the story of what happened to their kids and ask other parents to join them. And 98% of the parents wouldn't do it. They were more concerned about them being embarrassed than about what was going to happen to the other kids.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I just want to say one other thing about that too, just because the other way that this thing ties into the collapse of these industrial, productive livelihoods that were actually secure livelihoods that stabilized communities and, created multi-generational, successful economies. And, this may seem, but is that you also had, with the kind of economic benefits that came with that, you had things like short-term disability. Someone had an injury, right? They could be off work 2 to 3 months covered by short-term disability. Today, in the economy you have today, you don't get short-term disability. And you can't get disability for something that throws you out of work 2 to 3 months, 6 months. You have to be proven you're going to be disabled at least 1 year before you can get disability.
You better have a good lawyer.
Yeah.
Ron?
Yeah, just to go back what you just brought up again, this difference between Lynn's approach to a human being and a human society, a political society, and what we're actually dealing with, this destruction of the mind by the Burton Russells and the whole British operation. And I think it's the clearest example why people have to join and move with this organization at this level today, because it's like on the economy, like on the program, on the drugs itself. Lyndon LaRouche read this enemy in the opium wars that they ran. When I was in Chicago along with Diane and Pete and Marshall, when we launched this war on drugs in the United States coming off the drug book, one of the things already back then that was just obvious as you're doing walking tours and what it was already back there in the end of the 80s or 70s, really through the 80s. Every family had a story already, whether it was marijuana or some kind of situation. It was either the brother's family, their own family. Just there were times where you just hit a family and they would say, "You got to talk to my brother. You'd have to talk to my," and you'd like get whole networks that would open up to this. So in the 3/4 of a year, if it was that, maybe a half a year that we were putting out War on Drugs, the magazine, there was something like 25,000 subscriptions to that magazine went out. 18,000 of those were in Chicago, in the area. And that's where it really broke open. And the suit that shut down that magazine actually basically said we had to turn over the names of people because we were an educational function and we were tax exempt. It had to be tax exempt and all this. And so they were fighting to get the names of people so they could scare the shit out of people.
The names of subscribers?
Huh? The subscribers, yeah, because they were, and we said we were a political movement. So they actually succeeded in. Pat Cummings is still a lawyer. If he finds me on the street in Chicago today, he'd say, "Now you're not selling that magazine, are you?" I mean, literally at the point right before I left, I bumped into him, and but they shut down this magazine saying that we had to turn over the names, and we refused to do that. And we said we're a political organization. They defined us from the top down in the court that we were an educational operation, whether we claimed to be or not, and therefore, it had to be shut down. And they
You can't educate
successfully
people
did.
that drugs are bad.
What's that?
Said you can't educate people that drugs are bad. That has to be shut down.
So what you've got is a situation where if people go back and look, Lynn had a 15-point program to deal with the drug trade, from the fields, using the satellites and everything. And we actually worked with the Guatemalan government. There was an operation called Operation Guatusa, in which we worked with the government, and they deployed the military. Nobody could contact anyone. It was all on lockdown until they deployed. So nobody was in a position to leak to somebody else and get it out. And it was the most effective raid on marijuana and other kind of, not opioids, but the drug operations in, what's that?
Coca.
Coca, yeah. Anyway, it was the most effective lockdown in who they caught, and was a model for doing this stuff. And this is exactly why they went after LaRouche back then. And the fact that they put Janice on national TV on the Ted Koppel show, they put Dennis King on against her to go after them as two crazies going after each other, and it blew up in their face again. So this was really the center of the fight in the 80s, and we were winning elections, not only in 86 there, but prior to that, it was 17, 18, 25%. I was in a campaign out in west end of Minnesota, 32% of the vote in a vote in a run for Congress with Pat O'Reilly.
Yeah.
So this is why Lynn went to jail. They had to bust this thing. And the point I want to make is it's really at that level we're in it today. We're in a much better situation. They could put Lynn in jail back then. They could wreck the SDI program when Reagan adopted it. They've always been in position. The downing of the Berlin Wall, another opportunity was lost. We've got a situation today in which that British Empire that deploys at all these levels in multiple kind of attack, it's all vulnerable. So if people actually, like the conference we've got coming up, if people actually master Lynn's method and approach, and especially the 4 laws and the 4 powers, where you have the nations to actually win this from the top down against this British Empire and the financiers, just replace it. Glass-Steagall bankrupts this whole bunch. The entire, what we were saying at the end of the last Opal, $800 billion in drug money. That's not even the pharmaceuticals. But that all goes into a fixed banking control operation with Glass-Steagall. You can sort it out. So we're in the best position ever to win the whole thing, which is exactly why they can't have a president of the United States moving at the Bush's level. So everybody in this room has played roles in that, and we're now in a position to take the whole thing. And it should be a real powerful kind of energizer for all of us to complete this. And this book that we're reviewing here actually could have been totally avoided had we gone with the earlier book, Dope Inc., and shut them down.
Yep.
But let me just, I was going to mention this because the power of this evil, you know, at a certain point that we were taking on, Arthur Sackler founded the Medical Tribune in order to, you know, put these ideas out. He pushed his company clients to fund the continuing medical education. He, at the age of 73, died of a heart attack. He left behind a spectacular fortune and an industry so indebted to him, it referred to him by his name. And today, when I mentioned him, Mike said, "Oh, Arthur Sackler, there's a, you know, museum, you know, or something, you know."
Smithsonian Museum.
His name is this guy who's not there any longer, but you know who I'm talking about, right? Who started this whole idea of pushing drugs on these doctors, has his name on galleries or wings of the Smithsonian Institute, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, the Royal Academy of Sciences in London, as well as Princeton, Harvard, and Beijing universities. Medical facilities bear his name at Tel Aviv, Tufts, and New York universities. In 1996, he was one of the first 5 inductees into the Medical Advertising Hall of Fame. Now, these guys are now bankrupt because, you know, he would have apparently all kinds of muckety mucks at, you know, his soirees, and they're bankrupt. Joanne, did you have a question or a comment?
Well, I was going to say 2 things. With the numbers of deaths that you said that are on that map, how do you think the British people, do you think they follow the data or that information? You know, like you said several weeks ago, how they want to kill off so much in the population. Are you thinking they're tracking that information?
Oh, sure. You're talking not the British people, but the oligarchy, the Queen Elizabeth.
London people, English people. Yeah.
I just want to make sure because the poor British people are being screened by this stuff.
Killed by it.
But you know, okay,
Yeah.
but you think they're tracking the numbers?
Sure.
And what is the status over there when it comes to the drug epidemic? And the other thing I was going to say, when you do go to the, one thing I will say, these doctors, when I go get my medication, which they try to tell me I don't need it or whatever, and most of the time I don't want to take it because I read the printout. So they do give you enough education if you have your choice, and after you read all of that stuff and you say, do I really want to take this? Yeah, the side effects and everything else. And then you get a counsel. When I go up to the window to get my medication, the lady wants to hold me a 20-minute conversation about the do's and don'ts, what you mix with it, don't drink grapefruit, this, that, the other. By the time you leave out of there, you rather go out with the pain. So I know that's for me. I don't know how other people feel about that. So I think if they would promote that and put that educational component up and start going, like you said, you have to go back to these schools, places of education to educate people about this stuff. Maybe that might cut some of that down, or we work with the people, the lobbyists, work against them who are pushing for these drugs. Do they get the data or the information on that? Because after a while, money is, you know, you can be only so much greedy. You know what I'm saying? How much money do you need?
No.
It's ridiculous.
There's no limit.
There's no limit?
You know, the real issue, I think, is the question of what do we do about all of this?
Yeah.
And the real issue is those 4 laws, you know, that she started with. you know, Lynn's 4 laws. The first one of those laws is Glass-Steagall, which will bankrupt these bastards.
Now, we need to go into detail.
Oh, no,
on it.
Yeah.
I think we really
Yeah.
have to.
Joanne, did that answer your question? Or is that what
Yeah,
you were
well,
gonna say?
Yeah.
It's easy for me to see that these two aspects of the industrial takedown and the boom and illicit drug consumption potentiate each other, because if you don't have a workforce that's able to support that industry, you're not going to have it either. And without the industry, of course, you're not going to have productive occupation for anybody to aspire to. So yeah, that could have been foreseen at the outset, and I think it was.
I think it was also.
Mhm.
But, you know, we have a president now who does want to make the country great again. He does want to industrialize. He wants to build infrastructure. He wants to do these things. Now, the problem is, if most of his constituents are focused on building a damn wall, he's not going to be pushed to do it.
Yeah.
You know, they've got to be focused on, you know, LaRouche's 4 laws. They've got to be focused on Glass-Steagall, bankrupt these SOBs. You know, if you had Glass-Steagall, which said, remember Franklin Roosevelt, you know, one of the first things he did when he came in office, bank holiday, shut down all the banks, sent in the auditors, said, okay, show me whether you've got anything that's worth anything, because if you don't, you're bankrupt and you're being shut down. And a lot of banks got shut down in terms of bankruptcy. Then they passed Glass-Steagall, which said, okay, we're going to keep the commercial deposits over here in separate banks from the investment speculation, and the speculators aren't getting any backup. Now, think about all the money that's sloshing around, the drug money, the money, you know, that goes through these pharmaceutical companies on all these other things, that they don't have anything. It's not backed by anything real. If you have a population that says, we don't want to go, you know, it's as Lynn says at the end, the British Empire has only one option. They have to go down, because they've got to destroy the creative capabilities in the population, which create a lasting society. We don't. We have two. You know, we can change the policy and not go down with them.
I swear this is a related question.
Yeah.
Okay, what about the funds that are in offshore accounts, like, for instance, Cayman Islands, Bahamas, etc.? You know, how would the federal government be able to garnish those funds? I mean, we would be forced to send the troops somewhere nice for a change?
I think you should ask the man behind you, my husband. He's more of an expert on this.
Okay, all right, well, I mean, I think they'd be happy to invade the Bahamas.
Jamaica.
Yeah, Jamaica.
All they need is a tan.
Well, I mean,
If it was a serious question.
If we, the people, through our government, say we're not going to allow any of that money in those offshore banks to come ashore, and any banks that allows this money to be laundered onshore, you know, is going up the river, that can be shut down.
Yep.
But also, and as well, the U.S. Acosta, Antonio Maria Acosta, I remember his name right?
Antonio Maria Acosta.
From the UN.
From the UN, indicates, you know, it's known around the world. So countries around the world would be very glad to join with us to eliminate that spider's web, which and those offshore banks simply funnel money into London. That's where that money ends up, and from there financing the Queen and the Roman, the British Empire's apparat. But that can be closed down, absolutely. But I wanted to add one other thing. I mean, we're talking about it, the human dimension, the aesthetical education of man. I mean, what we're doing with the chorus, which we urge everybody to join us in the chorus. The work we're doing with music, alongside of the vision that Keisha's brought forward in terms of the space program. Creating a future. This is absolutely central. I mean, if we simply go back and try to do the war on drugs campaign right now, you know, it wouldn't work, by itself. So, you know, it really requires this multidimensional, if you will, approach, which is a fully human approach to creating a future. So you may,
Peter, did
Keisha
you-
might want to say something or whatever, but anyway.
Well, I was
wanna
just going to
bring
mention that.
up.
And we have, by the way, a concert on January 25th of the Schiller, Houston Community Course in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King's 90th birthday,
Oh, that's sweet.
which will demonstrate that they may have killed his body, but they can't kill the soul. Peter.
I just wanted to comment just about the offshore thing, because I remember a lot of these banks, they may have a lot of cash, but what they're doing is they're putting that money into these crazy derivatives and other things like that.
Mhm.
So if we have Glass-Steagall, any institution that wants to cooperate with the United States has to have their books examined, and only that which is valid investment could be recognized by the United States government. So, I mean, that would clean up an awful lot of what's out there, because an awful lot of it's in the computers. It's all in, the
Virtual.
virtual.
Yeah.
Good point. Yes.
Just to continue what Peter's saying, we, with Dope Incorporated, stopped the Hong
Marine
Kong and
Midland.
Shanghai Bank from buying up a US bank and getting a license as the Hong Kong Shanghai conglomerate to operate in the United States. Just a few years ago, when the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank had been indicted and convicted and only fined, a Senate committee was especially established, and the investigators who were friends of ours came up with an incredible report basically showing the Obama Justice Department that it was justified to take away that license which had been granted in 1978, 79 or whenever it was, okay? And that would just taking away their license to operate in the United States. You look at their books today and you say, well, you've been convicted this many times and no bankers have gone to jail. We're taking away your license for the United States. That's very simple.
There are many measures that can be taken. It's not for lack of, solutions. It's for lack of a movement that's committed to making it happen. And that does include, these 4 laws. If people have not read and circulated to others, the question of the 4 laws, get them out. I think we should probably end and then have an informal discussion unless there was anything else critical right now. Thank you all.